Hello and welcome once again to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite dining spots. I'm your host, Jack Aldane. On this episode, I'm speaking to politics lecturer at the University of York, Remi Adekoya, about his new book, Biracial Britain, A Different Way of Looking at Race. My next guest is a lecturer of politics at the University of York, whose name has been seen in multiple major news titles in the UK and the US. He's a regular columnist for the Nigerian news site Business Day, a son, a husband, a new father, half Nigerian, half Polish, and author of a book released this year, Biracial Britain, A Different Way of Looking at Race. Remi Adekoya. Remi, welcome.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for having me.
And more importantly, congratulations.
Thank you.
This is, of course, a book about being of mixed racial heritage in 21st century Britain and the dual front on which mixed race people seemingly spend their entire lives fighting. There's the fight for individuality, distinction, freedom from categorization, and then there's the fight for acceptance, association, and belonging, battles that are hard to win simultaneously. If I may, let's start with you. You're half Nigerian, half Polish, as I've just mentioned. Tell us about your background, how you came to write this book, and what specifically you wanted this book to reveal.
So my background is I was born to a Nigerian father and Polish mother in Nigeria. I spent the first 17 years of my life in Nigeria. So I went to primary and secondary school. In Nigeria, we start a little bit earlier. So I'd finished my secondary school by the age of 17. And so my initial experiences of being mixed race were of being of mixed black-white heritage in a virtually all-black society. And so there was definitely that sense of difference. So that sense of difference is clearly communicated to you at a very early stage. So, for instance, walking on the streets with my white Polish mom, kids often, would point at us and call us the term which is the Nigerian equivalent of white people. There usually wasn't anything, almost always wasn't anything sort of malicious in it, but it was a sort of pointing out that, oh, look, white people. I actually can't remember a time when I didn't feel different from the immediate environment around me. But of course, you see, there's different kinds of different. There is, oh, you are a slightly or very different person from us, full stop. And there is a, oh, you are a different and worse kind of person from us. So in the Nigerian context, being mixed white definitely didn't qualify me for being seen, or didn't entail being seen as a different, worse kind of person. And then I moved to Poland after that, after my secondary school there. And so now I was living in a virtually all-white society. and that experience was very different. And here the experience was often negative. So when people looked at me in Poland, they didn't see a mixed race person, and much less someone of Polish heritage. They saw a black person simply. And, stereotypes and perceptions of black people. So I'm talking, sort of late 1990s when I moved to Poland. So we're very negative then. And generally, I got called all sorts of names, on the streets and things like that. So that kind of, crude sort of racism, which used to also exist in Britain, but probably more so in the 1970s, 1980s. So I experienced all that. And then definitely in Poland, I started to see myself, and generally identify as a black person because of those experiences. And I remember my mom, and I wrote about this in the book, when my mom visited me in Poland a couple of years later, told me after time, she said, what's going on? You start every sentence now with, oh, we Nigerians this, we black people that, we Africans this, where's all this coming from? This wasn't the way you were talking when you were growing up in Nigeria. What's all this Malcolm X stuff and all that, coming out from you, like, so strongly, and, I thought about it, and I knew she was right. Indeed, I stopped thinking of myself as an individual, but had gone into a very sort of racialist kind of thinking, of how I viewed the world, essentially, because of my personal experiences there. until, things sort of improved in Poland when Poland joined the EU in 2004. More foreigners started coming into the country sort of opened up more. Poles started traveling around the world more, around Europe here, coming to countries like the UK and other countries where there's significant numbers of black or brown skinned people. And so, the general atmosphere in Poland became, much more tolerant. It became easier to breathe, so to speak.
So you had that experience of two worlds and two very different ways of being regarded. Although, as you mentioned, in Nigeria, and we'll come to this later, you were subjected to what you might call low-level racial slurs.
I wouldn't call them slurs, but othering, definitely. What is called othering, definitely.
I'm technically mixed race. I'm for the most part English, but I'm a quarter Maltese, and as such, I've passed for a white Briton my entire life. But reading this book was really eye-opening because the crude assumption I think many people often make is that mixed-race people, to use a particularly apt phrase, have less skin in the game when it comes to racism. But the picture we get in this book shows just how alienating life can be for people who fall between the cracks, particularly when they're told you don't belong here by both halves of their heritage. And when any attempt to self-identify is rejected as either evasive or even selfish, I'm going to ask you to explain, going back to the point we just made, what the words Oyinbo and Muzungu mean.
Yes, so they mean essentially literally white person. They mean essentially literally white person. So it doesn't have a negative connotation. It's not like gaijin, for instance, in Japanese, which meant or means, I think foreign devil. So it doesn't have that kind of negative connotation. It simply means it's literally like saying, black person or white person. And I wouldn't say that, I got I got a message from general Nigerian society that I didn't belong there. That I wouldn't go that far. I definitely got a message that people sort of, wondered, if I identified with the society. They obviously questioned the authenticity of my Nigerianness. In Nigeria, of course, there's ethnicity, so there are various ethnic groups. So what really matters there is, what ethnic group you are associated with. So the real questions I got regarding the authenticity of my identity within Nigeria was regarding how much of Yoruba culture. So my dad belonged to the Yoruba ethnic group. So people, would question sort of, oh, can I speak Yoruba language? Or probably I don't know the customs. Probably I don't know the culture because, I have this white mother. So yes, so I'm not really a real Yoruba person. So that's where people would, on that they would focus. But the Nigerian identity is so broad and all-encompassing that, there is no sort of strict connection of that to a particular kind of culture or even, so much a skin color. Yeah.
There was one recollection you make being age 9 at a juju dance competition. And this was a sort of a test in Nigeria of your authenticity.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So it's a great example you give, because that juju music, again, as I just mentioned, is connected to ethnicity within Nigeria. So juju music is a kind of music which is played and popular within people from my dad's particular ethnic group within Nigeria, which dominates the southwest of the country. And so there was a dancing competition. Both my parents were there, and my mom definitely. And there's this thing in Nigeria. So, kids, so they gather kids around, the DJ plays a song, and kids dance to that song. Then the DJ stops. The audience takes a vote, by acclamation, who won that round of dancing. And then the winner is decided, the second or third, by, like I say, popular acclaim. Then the DJ plays another song, usually from another genre of music. Kids dance again, the same process continues. And at the end, a final winner is pronounced. And so earlier on in the competition, when, it was rap songs being played or pop songs being played, I did quite well. But then the final round came and they played juju music, which is this, like I say, traditional Yoruba music, which I had no clue how to dance to. So when they played the song, I just froze, Then I started, trying to move, and, sort of the crowd burst in laughter. Oh, look at the Oyinbo, he doesn't know how to dance juju music. And, that, of course, killed all my self-confidence. And, from that moment, I was just, praying for the song to end and for this torture to end. And so overall, I didn't win the dancing competition. So, and what was important here is that, like I say, I once saw my dad dancing to that music much later in life, and he was equally terrible at it. But you see, nobody laughed at him because he never had to prove his Yoruba-ness. Because when you are 100%, so to speak, both your parents are Yoruba, you don't have to prove your Yoruba-ness. Nobody questions it. But when you are mixed, when there's a foreign element in you, then you have to prove your authenticity. And this is, I think, an experience which many mixed race people have, irrespective of, culture or racial configuration, that there's always that sort of doubt there, that, oh, are you really Maltese? Or, Jack, how Maltese are you really? Or sort of, how British are you really? And you have to prove it, So that's where the sort of problem comes in.
The example you give there, it made me think about the fact that so much of this authenticity question comes down to how much pressure is applied at home. To what extent do you think that responsibility for building a child's self-confidence lies with the family more than perhaps it does with the outside community or society at large?
So I think crucial, and this is very important for parents of young mixed race children in Britain, and there's an increasing number of those kinds of parents. So it's really crucial at these early experiences, really crucial at the signals the child gets from the parents. So I noticed that children first of all, overall theme, nothing replaces unconditional love when it comes to fostering a sense of confidence in a child. And this is irrelevant whether it's a mixed race child or a monoracial child, whatever. Children who clearly receive the unconditional love from either both their parents, if they lived at home with both their parents, or from the parent who might have brought them up on their own, are different human beings, really, from those who didn't receive that at a young age. More of a confidence in them, and they're able to generally deal with life situations much better, and they're generally, less sort of prone, they are less easily hurt by the world. Okay, because that unconditional love gives you a shield, and it's a shield which you carry for the rest of your life. And this is something which was very clear to me, irrespective of whether I was speaking to people who were 20 or 50.
Let's talk about colorism and the one-drop rule, which I'll ask you to explain in a moment. This is a dogma that appeals to both proud BAME communities and white supremacists at the same time. The idea, in other words, that if you're not completely white, you're black. Whoever applies it, it's really a method of controlling people, isn't it?
So this is strictly connected to the black-white mix. And, so what started up by white supremacists and segregationists in America hundreds of years ago who wanted to essentially limit the number of people who could qualify, for whiteness. And to also make sure, to sort of, so to limit the white race to be as quote unquote pure as possible, to limit the potential of people, for instance, who used to be called mulattoes in those days. So children, for instance, of slave owners and slaves, because there were children like that at the time, for them never to be able to qualify as white, but also to essentially be black. And so the rule was developed that a drop of black blood means you're essentially black. And this has created all sorts of problems for people over the years. And, and there were stories, of course, of people who were born, who have some black heritage, but didn't look it, and who spent their whole lives hiding that part of their heritage and trying to pretend essentially that they were full white. And then, somebody might find out and oh my God, it was, a huge problem. So that's and that still applies up till today. So for instance, 2007, Barack Obama, then candidate Barack Obama, I remember, was asked in a CBS interview that, your mother is white. You were raised by your, white mother and your white grandparents. When did you decide you were black? And I remember what he said, and in his answer is everything. He said, well, I don't think I ever decided I was black, that the reality is simply that in American society, if you look the way I look, you are seen as black. And that when a child senses this pretty early on, and when you see that, okay, that's how people see me, you also start to think of yourself in that way. And that this is why so many people in his position in the US simply think of themselves as black. Because, how do you not think of yourself as a thing if everybody else around you tells you are a thing? It's quite difficult.
Yeah.
That's really pushing nonconformism to a very high level.
The other high-profile example of this is Tiger Woods, who, as you probably know, described himself as a Cablinasian quite early on in his career, the Caucasian, Black, Asian, which spoke to all of his heritages. Conversely, he was lambasted by a lot of African Americans for suggesting that you could identify as anything other than Black if you had Black heritage. So that's the other side of it. What's your perspective on this, the way it cuts both ways?
Yeah, so you see, so this has a lot to do with sort of, group strategies, history, and psychology. So historically, Black people have been denied prestige on a global stage as a result of their Blackness. And so this is why when Black people see people who are mixed race, lighter skinned, who don't emphasize their Blackness, they interpret this as, so this person is trying to distance themselves from Blackness because they think Blackness is something to be ashamed of, the way Michael Jackson did. They think Blackness is something to be ashamed of, that is a stigma. So there's a defensive reaction like that, or even, so what, they think they are better than Black people, They think because they're mixed race that they're better than Black people, that they're higher up the hierarchy than we are. And so there's that kind of reaction, there's that kind of defensive reaction, there's that kind of annoyance sometimes, like I said, because there have been cases in history of mixed race people, especially light-skinned, trying to pretend they have no Black heritage whatsoever. And this is humiliating. So there's that. So there's that element there. Then there's also the element, if you look at it, if you think in group psychology of sort of wider strategies of achieving objectives, then it pays for our numbers to be as high as possible as any group, okay? Because the way groups get generally what they want, the way they achieve their aims, as postulated by whatever leaders they might have at any point in time, having numbers behind you always helps. And so from a strategic point of view, it makes sense for Black leaders to want those classified as Black to be as many as possible, okay? One, we can then say, we are speaking on behalf of 5 million people, for instance, and not 500,000 people, okay? So you always have a bigger claim when you can claim, there's more of you, So it makes sense from that point of view to try and keep the group as large as possible, So to try and keep all those with a Black heritage identifying Black, rather than having them cut out from the group.
There's a scene in the book where you describe two mixed-race friends with two daughters, both of whom have known each other for a very long time, really, since they were little, and who, as you recount, one day fall out when one refers to the other as Black by way of encouragement, and the other takes offense and rejects them, and there's tears and so on. Bearing in mind these girls were born within the last 10 years and brought up in a multi-ethnic community, it's quite unsettling, as you yourself write, that there should be such scenes among children today. What's happening there?
So, okay, first of all, there's a whole thing, and this is not discussed in Britain and should. So there's a whole different psyche generally among minorities, not just Black and brown skin minorities here in Britain, generally among minorities. And studies have shown what, social scientists have called the psychological asymmetry. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Sunnis in Iraq or Alawites in pre-Civil War Syria, or the Jamaican community here in Britain, there is always a sort of greater angst among minorities as to their position and status within society. That is sometimes alleviated if, say, that particular group is very economically successful, for instance, because there's a strength that comes from that, or there's a feeling of strength that comes from that. But if we are not just a minority, but also don't seem to have much economic power, don't seem to have much political power, there's a general sense of vulnerability that will be amongst that minority population. And this is a general standard for human behavior. If it was the case that Black children felt that the overwhelming majority of white people have a positive opinion of Black people, they'd have no problem with being Black. Of course not, So clearly they sense that it seems, this being Black thing is not really seen as such a positive thing. And now the question is why. Of course, think about it. You watch media, you watch news about, okay, what kind of Black people do you see in the news? So apart from the people you see here in Britain, let's say you're watching world news, so for instance about Africa, the main Black continent, where you see that you see a lot of poverty, conflict, all those kind of things. There doesn't seem to be much positive coming out of there. And of course, for the younger generation, they do have some musicians, they listen to, African pop stars, etc. But on balance, I would say the general sort of message you can get coming out is that, there's something somewhere not really working within, this Black group that I belong to. And so these are how these sorts of complexes develop.
And this speaks to the problem of social mobility, which is a very interesting thread, because when a lot of your interviewees, for example, describe going to school and Black female students would see their male counterparts with white women, they would feel jealousy and anger and resentment about this. And similarly, where Black men have often seen Black women going with white men, there is a similar defensiveness. I mean, even the story you tell just then of the two girls, how they fell out because one of the girls who quite liked a boy was told that he didn't find Black girls attractive.
It all boils down to, the opinions others have about us. When you mention that opinion of attractiveness, that's a really difficult one actually to try and figure out. I think it's easier to actually deal with issues of, are people able to have equal opportunities for jobs? Are people able to have equal opportunities to get into good universities? Those are things I think we can, deal with more realistically, actually, and probably should start with those kinds of things, because, how you are actually going to, try and impose a situation whereby more from the majority population of, say, white males will be interested in developing relationships in the sense of intimate relationships with Black women. How you actually go about imposing that, I don't really see, and I'm not even really sure if it's something, we can or should do. I don't know how you would go about that.
You said recently on a Radio 4 program about the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah that it's really down to the 66 million people living in Britain today to tackle racism on the ground in our own lives, not members of the royal family. To what extent do you think it matters if the royal family is racist?
It matters because of those things I talked about, like regarding prestige factors. So those are important things. Those are important things to people psychologically. The reason why it was such a big deal for so many, not all definitely, but for so many within the Black communities of Britain that, Meghan appeared and married into the family was because of the prestige associated with being married into the royal family, because it doesn't get more prestigious than that in this country. Okay, the highest level of prestige you can achieve in this country is, to be in the royal family. And so that's why it was such a powerful moment for so many. Plus, of course, the whole idea of her as a princess. And here we get to the looks part. What is the ideal of a beautiful woman, that girls learn about, growing up? It's a princess. The princess is beautiful. The princess is the ideal. The princess is worshipped essentially by everyone around her. And so when Meghan came, so you have this quote unquote, Black princess who came and who is not just marrying into the royal family. So there's that prestige aspect, but she's beautiful. She's pretty. Everybody, is talking about this. She's a princess. So she's that who all of us would wish we could be if we're talking from the point of view of Black women, in the sense of we all wish we could be treated this way.
Has there been a huge opportunity for British soft power missed there?
Oh, definitely, I think so. And I don't know the details, of course, of what was really going on when she was around, and who said what to whom, and who started what, and etc. So obviously, I don't know all that, and I do think it's unfair to just jump to conclusions that it was definitely this or it was definitely that. But looking at it from the point of view of consequences. Definitely the consequences, as a whole, have not been positive, for the royal family, and they've definitely not been positive for the image of Britain as a whole. And as I said recently, Britain has always, one huge advantage it's had, it's always done soft power very well, And sometimes it's incredible to actually read some of the accounts of the colonial encounters between, for instance, I wrote my PhD dissertation and a lot focus of it on colonial Nigeria. And sometimes it's actually incredible to see the cordial relationships and the cordial attitude, the positive attitude of even leaders of the pro-independence movements in Nigeria towards the British.
Could you give me an example of this that you found most profound?
That I found most profound, simply just, comments which would be made, like I said, amongst top Nigerian intellectual leaders of the time, towards the angle of, for instance, some of them would say that, the British, are fundamentally fair people. Of course, we don't want them here. And this whole, colonial empire thing is wrong. Definitely. But, generally, they're quite fair people, which is an incredible thing to imagine, being said by people, under your colonial subjugation. You understand, that's not the kind of thing you would expect them to say. But it's because of that, British ability to be tactful, to be very good with language, to know how to sort of, resolve conflicts in that kind of diplomatic way. And, the British have a way of talking and, and coming across, really as nice and sort of, calming down situations. That is really very effective communication. It's really very effective communication. And this is why even people who, had every right to actually strongly dislike the British, very often some of those top leaders obviously they would say this more in, private conversations within each other, would say, these people are not so bad after all. Other colonial powers didn't have that. There was no incident of, of people, for instance, pro-independence leaders within Portuguese colonies or Belgian colonies speaking positively of those ones. That didn't happen.
To what extent do you agree that Britain increasingly imports a lot of its racial anxieties from the US?
Generally speaking, the US clearly has an oversized, I would argue, influence on general world debate. So generally, anything which happens in the US, which touches on a social issue that also is a thing in other societies, those societies will often discuss them in the context of, how does it work in America? So yes, I do think too much is definitely drawn from that. Why does it happen? It happens because the US is the only other Western, so white majority society to host a significant Black and brown skinned population. Okay? The same cannot be said of Belgium or Denmark or even Canada or any of those other countries. If France doesn't hold ethnicity figures, there's probably definitely a strong, a sizable minority population there. So I think, number one, it comes from this. The US is, like I said, that key country that is somehow like us regarding demographics. That's one. Two, there's obviously the Anglo-Saxon connection. It's part of the English-speaking world. So, you wouldn't expect people here to focus on what's happening in Germany with minorities in Germany. But they will focus on, again, so there's that, Anglo-Saxon sort of connection. Plus, I think if we're talking intellectual trends, again, the US tends to influence many other societies with its intellectual trends, be it economic, philosophical, maybe not so much philosophical, but economic definitely, and that applies also to race. So that's also another reason why those trends sort of filter down here.
This is sometimes called the African century, the one we're living through, sometimes the Chinese century. I was wondering, how hopeful or excited are you for the former of the two?
I hope things work out well, definitely for the African continent. I do see a lot of challenges, which I don't think are being properly addressed at the moment. And it's going to be rough, especially following COVID. So even rich countries like Britain have suffered huge economic blows because of COVID and have spent an incredible amount of money just trying to, keep people from, having to source food from food banks in the past 1-2 years. But, other countries in Africa don't have that kind of money. There's no help coming to people from, there are no follow schemes paying people's salaries. This is not happening. And so, unfortunately, I think the post-COVID reality of Africa is going to be incredibly difficult. And definitely today, the continent as a whole is much worse off than it was a year ago. And it wasn't that well off a year ago. And so in the short term, I definitely see huge challenges. If those challenges are confronted, then definitely in the long term, so if we're talking, a decade from now, I do definitely see huge potential on the continent.
Jay Leno, the American talk show host, has recently sort of issued a public apology about the many, many jokes he's made at the expense of East Asian people, saying that he always knew that this was racism like any other. Is racism against the Chinese in particular still a conversation we've yet to have here properly in Britain and the West more broadly?
I think so, definitely. And the racism, of course, towards Chinese is still, because I maintain very strongly that people tend to feel better than those they are materially better than. This is a general rule. The rich tend to feel better than the poor on an individual basis. A rich white Brit will tend to feel better than a poor white Brit. And it then works on group basis. So white people generally will feel better than black people because collectively white people are much better off than black people are from a material point of view. So this is an unfortunate aspect of human nature. And, lots have been written on classism. And we see that every day here in the UK. Now, with the Chinese case, the Chinese have, I think, vastly improved perceptions of what Chineseness means in the world in the past 30, 40 years. So now, everybody talks about China as a superpower. In academia, where I am, you can't essentially have a module that discusses international politics without loads of articles on, what is China going to do on this issue? What is China going to do on that issue? Is China going to take over from the US, et cetera, et cetera? So the fact that focus even exists lends prestige to Chineseness. However, at an individual level, if we're talking per capita wealth, people still hear stories of Chinese migrants, unfortunately, dying in trucks trying to get into the UK. So clearly, the message that still comes to people is that, so clearly things are not rosy out there. So people still know that, you see. I believe it would be, there would be a much better perception today of Chineseness if in per capita wealth, China was at such a stage that no Chinese person would need to risk their life getting into, being locked up, in a lorry, just trying to get into Britain. Because there's no Japanese people risking their lives getting into trucks trying to come into Britain. There's none. I'm not saying that, once a group becomes wealthy, then all prejudice towards it disappears. No, but a different kind of prejudice appears. So look at the kinds of stereotypes that are targeted at Jewish minorities. It's not the stereotype of lazy, no-gooders, ineffective, etc. It's actually the opposite stereotype that, oh my God, they're so clever, they actually run the world.
Well, I've yet to read David Baddiel's Jews Don't Count, but I'm prepared to have my mind blown by all accounts of those who have read it. Your new daughter is 5 days old. Your wife is Nigerian, is that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can I ask, how do all the things that you've written in this book, all the stories you've heard, all the experiences you've had to date, lead you to think about what it means to now be embarking on the project of being a father?
I'll tell you one thing. So it's been 5 days, and we've already had a couple of questions from different people, as luck would have it, from the Nigerian side, who ask immediately, is she light-skinned?
A question the royal family would ask in reverse.
Yeah. And this, not just one person, not two person. It's come from a couple, not two people. It's come from a couple of sources. So because I am mixed and my wife is 100%, so to speak, Nigerian, people didn't know how the kids, because the kids of people like me and my wife, that combination of, a mixed black and white person and a full black person can come out, various shades of skin color. So the kid could be very dark skinned or could be light skinned. You never know. And so people didn't know. People weren't sure how the kid, how she would come out. And so that was a key question people ask. Oh, is she light? And it is asked in the context of, oh, it would be good if she were, My wife generally is very annoyed by those questions and doesn't really answer those questions, but they are definitely asked in that context of, oh, it would be nice if she were, it would be better if she were than if she wasn't. Yeah. So this is a real thing. As the father of a child here in Britain, I still do think this is probably, definitely in the Western world, one of the best societies where my daughter could be growing up as someone of color, as someone, who has parents of our heritage. So I can't really think of another country I'd like to raise her in, or I choose to raise her in over Britain.
Why is that?
It's because of my personal experiences here have been generally very positive. There have been a couple of incidents questionable, but overall, we definitely both feel quite good here. We both feel quite good here. We breathe easy here. Of course, there'll be challenges. I think a lot depends also on the region of Britain in which we live. There are regions which are, more open, where you generally feel more welcome. There are regions where you feel less so. Definitely one thing I will try to do, like I said, key for me is that unconditional love. That's number one. If I want to make her strong, we need to give her that. If we give her that, everything else will be easier. Nothing will be easy because life is not easy, but it will be easier. And with regards to identity, I definitely, my wife is great. She a full Nigerian, but she takes Polish lessons. She tries to teach herself Polish because she also wants, the child to recognize that she does also have a Polish heritage, even though unfortunately my mom is late, and so she won't have that, direct contact with a Polish family member. But my wife wants her to have that Polish connection and to also, have something there. And if she decides to develop her interest in that direction, if she starts asking me questions, later on that, about Poland and, how is it in Poland, or, could we visit Poland? I'd definitely be happy to, to show it to her. So we'll try to talk to her about, Nigeria, what Nigerianness is, what Polishness is, and let her essentially gravitate towards whatever identity, she feels a need to.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Remi, and I wish you all the very, very best. The last question I have is a question I ask all my guests who I ideally like to meet at their favourite places to eat and drink, as you know, on the Booking Club. This is a particularly interesting question to ask somebody of split heritage. I've been to many, many great Polish restaurants here in London where I live. I haven't been to nearly enough Nigerian places, but where would you say is your favourite place to eat, and does it have any connection whatsoever to your heritage?
I'm trying to remember now. We went to a really good restaurant with excellent food it was in Peckham, 44, double four, something like that. And food there was definitely excellent. Aside that, there's Fazenda in Leeds, which I love, which is Brazilian, and they do this Brazilian, where they, come and, with grilled meat and sort of cut it in front of you. And so that's fantastic. Me and my wife love that. But I do have to tell you that post-COVID, if you were to take me somewhere in London, I'd actually ask to go to a Polish restaurant because there are no Polish restaurants here in Sheffield. So I definitely actually like to go to a Polish restaurant in London if you were to take me somewhere. When
lockdown lifts, and if you have the time, I can take you to one as authentic and as hospitable as anywhere you've been to in Poland.
Okay. I'll hold you to that.
Thank you so much, Remi.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Take care.